7 celebrated leaders with shockingly dark sides. What they never told you in school history remembers heroes. We raise statues, name streets, teach their victories in school books. But what if the stories we celebrate leave something out? What if the leaders we admire had darker sides we were never taught? This video isn't about canceling the past. It's about seeing it clearly, beyond the parades and polished quotes. Because real people are never perfect, and true history is never simple. These 7 world leaders shaped the world. But they also made decisions, violent, racist, corrupt, or hypocritical, that textbooks rarely mention. This is lesson lost. And these are 7 celebrated leaders with shockingly dark sides. Let's begin. Winston Churchill, war hero or imperial enforcer. He is remembered as the man who stood against Hitler, the prime minister who inspired Britain during its darkest hour. The voice that rallied a nation with words like Winston Churchill is often celebrated as one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century. But there's a side of Churchill's story that rarely makes it into history class. Let's begin in India, then a British colony under imperial rule. In 1943, a catastrophic famine struck the Bengal region. Over 3 million people died of starvation and disease. And while the drought was real, the disaster was not just natural, it was political. Churchill's government diverted food supplies from India to British troops and European reserves. He refused pleas for aid from Indian leaders. Even when Australia offered to send shipments of rice, Churchill delayed them. His justification? He blamed the famine on the Indian people themselves, saying they breed like rabbits. When told of the rising death toll, he allegedly responded, "This wasn't an isolated incident." Churchill was a fierce defender of the British Empire. He once said, he supported the use of chemical weapons against uprisings in the Middle East. In Kenya, during the Mau Mau rebellion, his policies led to mass detentions, torture, and executions of African civilians. And while he's remembered as a hero of democracy, Churchill opposed self-rule for colonized nations. He was against granting independence to India and saw colonial people as unfit to govern themselves. This side of Churchill is rarely shown in the same breath as his wartime leadership. But it's part of the same mandate. He was a gifted speaker, a strategist, and a symbol of resistance. He also held deeply racist imperialist views and made decisions that cost millions of lives. So which version is true? Both. Churchill's legacy is a mix of brilliance and brutality. He stood against fascism while upholding empire. He inspired the free world while denying freedom to others. Understanding the full picture doesn't erase his victories. It just makes them honest. Because true history doesn't worship. It remembers fully. Mahatma Gandhi, prophet of peace or prisoner of prejudice? Mahatma Gandhi is celebrated worldwide as a symbol of peace. He's the man who defeated an empire without firing a bullet. His philosophy of nonviolent resistance inspired civil rights leaders from Martin Luther King Jr. to Nelson Mandela. But behind the legend of Gandhi lies a far more complicated figure. Let's start in South Africa, where Gandhi spent over 2 decades before returning to India. There, he fought bravely for the rights of Indian immigrants, demanding better treatment and equality. But in doing so, he made a disturbing distinction. He demanded Indian superiority over black Africans. Gandhi referred to black South Africans using racist terms. He objected to Indians being placed in the same jails as Africans. He even wrote, he described native Africans as uncivilized and dirty, and argued that Indians deserved better treatment because they were more advanced. Even for his time, these views were shockingly racist. Gandhi's defenders say his views changed over time. But there's little evidence he ever truly recanted or addressed these early writings. Now let's look at gender. Gandhi promoted a strict form of chastity and celibacy, not just for himself, but for others too. He opposed birth control. He discouraged sexuality, even in marriage. He believed that self-denial was a form of spiritual strength. But his methods raised serious ethical questions. In his later years, Gandhi slept naked next to young women, including relatives, as a way to test his self-control. He claimed it was a spiritual experiment, but many scholars and critics today see it as manipulative and deeply problematic. His treatment of his wife, Kasturba, was also troubling. He often made unilateral decisions for her, sometimes denying her access to medical treatment. He expected her to follow his lifestyle without question. On the issue of caste, Gandhi is often praised for fighting against untouchability, the cruel practice of excluding lower caste people in Hindu society. He called them Harijans, children of God, but he never fully opposed the caste system itself. He believed it could be reformed, not abolished. This put him at odds with B.R. Ambedkar, a Dalit leader who demanded full equality. Ambedkar saw Gandhi's Harijan label as paternalistic, not empowering. When Ambedkar pushed for separate political representation for Dalits, Gandhi went on a hunger strike to stop him. It worked, but many saw it as moral blackmail. So what do we make of this? Mahatma Gandhi helped lead India to freedom. He rejected violence when most chose war. He stood against empire with nothing but truth and discipline. But he also held racist views, practiced questionable personal behaviors, and limited the full empowerment of the marginalized. Does that erase his achievements? No doubt, but it reminds us that spiritual greatness doesn't equal moral perfection, and that even the most celebrated prophets can be trapped by the prejudices of their time. Gandhi asked the world to seek truth. In honoring him, we should do the same. Abraham Lincoln, the emancipator with boundaries, he's the man who saved the Union. The president who ended slavery. The face carved into Mount Rushmore, sitting beside giants of American history. Abraham Lincoln is often hailed as a moral titan, a leader who risked everything to free the enslaved and preserve democracy. But Lincoln's legacy is more complex than the legend suggests. Let's start with what many people don't know. When Lincoln took office in 1861, abolishing slavery was not his primary goal. In his own words, for Lincoln, the preservation of the Union came first. Emancipation was a tactic, not the mission. It wasn't until halfway through the Civil War in 1863 that he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. But even then, it only applied to Confederate-held territories. That means enslaved people in Union-loyal states like Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland were not immediately freed. It was a bold step, yes, but also a strategic move to weaken the Confederacy and prevent European powers from supporting the South. Now let's talk about Lincoln's views on race. Despite his opposition to slavery, Lincoln did not believe in full racial equality, at least not early in his career. In a public debate in 1858, he said he supported the idea of colonization, resettling freed black people outside the U.S., in places like Liberia or Central America. Even as late as 1862, Lincoln met with black leaders to discuss the idea of voluntary emigration. He believed whites and blacks could not live together peacefully, a view shaped by the racism of his time, but still shocking today. Of course, Lincoln grew. The war changed him. By the end of his life, he supported limited black suffrage and spoke with more conviction about equality. He invited Frederick Douglass to the White House. He praised the bravery of black soldiers in the Union Army, and he gave his life just days after the Confederacy surrendered. But the idea of Lincoln as a lifelong crusader for racial justice is oversimplified. He was a man shaped by moral conflict, political pressure, and strategic calculation. A man who made progress, but not perfection. There's also his response to Native Americans. In 1862, during his presidency, the largest mass execution in U.S. history took place, the hanging of 38 Dakota men in Minnesota. They were involved in an uprising fueled by broken treaties and starvation. Lincoln reduced the death sentences from over 300 to 38, a mercy, some say. But the hangings went forward, and few remember this part of his legacy. So what's the truth? Lincoln preserved the Union. He pushed the nation forward. He used his power to begin the end of slavery and inspired millions. But he was also limited by the politics, prejudices, and possibilities of his time. He wasn't a saint. He was a strategist, a leader with vision, but also with boundaries. To admire Lincoln fully, we must see him fully, not just in marble, but in motion, struggling, learning, and changing. That's what makes him human, and that's what makes him real. John F. Kennedy, charisma in public, chaos in private. He was young. He was charming. He gave speeches that stirred the soul and brought hope to a new generation. He promised a new frontier and inspired Americans to reach for the moon. John F. Kennedy was more than a president. He was a cultural icon. He symbolized vitality, progress, and grace under pressure. But behind the polished image was a presidency held together by secrets, risk, and reckless behavior. Let's begin with his most famous moment, the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October 1962, the world came within inches of nuclear war. Soviet missiles had been installed in Cuba. Tensions soared, and Kennedy managed to negotiate a peaceful resolution, a move that historians widely praise. But what most textbooks don't emphasize is that JFK's earlier actions helped provoke the crisis in the first place. Just 1 year earlier, he approved the Bay of Pigs invasion, a failed CIA-backed operation to overthrow Fidel Castro. The mission was a disaster. It embarrassed the United States and pushed Cuba directly into the arms of the Soviet Union. The missiles weren't the start of the problem. They were a reaction, one triggered, at least in part, by Kennedy's own decisions. Now let's talk about his personal life. Publicly, JFK was a devoted family man, privately, comma. He led a life of serial affairs, secret rendezvous, and risky relationships. He had numerous extramarital affairs, including rumored liaisons with Marilyn Monroe, White House staffers, and even women tied to organized crime. Some of these affairs occurred while he was in office, and while the Cold War was at its most dangerous. Why does this matter? Because his personal recklessness opened him to blackmail and compromised national security. The FBI and CIA were well aware of his behavior and spent significant resources covering it up. Then there's his health, another carefully guarded secret. JFK suffered from Addison's disease, a serious adrenal disorder. He also had chronic back pain, digestive issues, and frequent infections. To function, he was on a cocktail of medications, including painkillers, stimulants, sedatives, and even steroids. At times, he was making decisions of global consequence while heavily medicated. His health problems were hidden from the public. Photos were staged. Medical reports were altered. The image of youthful strength was carefully constructed, but far from real. And then there's Vietnam. While many people believe JFK would have pulled the U.S. out of the Vietnam conflict, the evidence is inconclusive. Under his leadership, American troop presence in Vietnam skyrocketed, from a few hundred to over 16,000 advisors. He supported the coup against South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem, which led to instability and eventually full-scale war. He spoke of peace, but he often chose escalation. So why is JFK remembered so fondly? Partly because he was assassinated at 46, young, idealistic, full of potential. He didn't live long enough to become unpopular. He didn't face the long-term consequences of his choices. And partly because the Kennedy family, and a sympathetic media, worked hard to protect and preserve his image. But history deserves more than myths. John F. Kennedy was a gifted speaker, a brilliant campaigner, and a man who inspired millions. He also took extraordinary risks with his body, his policies, and his personal life. He governed with charisma, but often from the edge of collapse. To admire JFK without question is to miss the deeper lesson. That image is not leadership, and that sometimes the most beautiful portraits hide the deepest cracks. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the defender of freedom who interned thousands. He led America through its darkest economic collapse. He brought hope with the New Deal. He stood tall against fascism during World War II. He's often ranked as one of the greatest U.S. presidents in history. Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR, served 4 terms, guiding a broken nation into recovery, then into victory. His voice through the radio, his calm during chaos, made him a symbol of strength. But even the strongest leaders have shadows, and one of FDR's darkest decisions happened not in Europe, but at home. After Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, America was gripped by fear. People worried about spies, sabotage, and another strike. In that climate, FDR signed Executive Order 9066. It authorized the forced relocation and imprisonment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, the majority of whom were U.S. citizens. Entire families were removed from their homes on the West Coast. They had days, sometimes hours, to pack up their lives. Businesses were lost. Property was seized. Futures were erased. They were placed in internment camps, surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by soldiers, and cut off from society. No trials, no convictions, just a collective punishment based on ancestry. FDR justified it as military necessity. But internal government documents at the time, including from the FBI, concluded there was no evidence of a widespread threat. So why did it happen? Political pressure, racist stereotypes, and a willingness to sacrifice civil liberties in the name of national security. This decision has been condemned by historians, civil rights advocates, and even later presidents. In 1988, the U.S. government formally apologized and offered compensation to survivors. But FDR's role is often minimized in the retelling of the war. And it wasn't the only exclusion in his policies. During the Great Depression, his New Deal programs helped millions. But they didn't help everyone equally. Many programs excluded Black Americans, particularly in the South, where segregationist lawmakers shaped how aid was distributed. Domestic workers and farm laborers, many of whom were Black or Hispanic, were left out of Social Security and labor protections. Roosevelt made compromises with Southern Democrats to keep the New Deal alive, at the cost of racial equity. And what about the Holocaust? FDR has been criticized for his slow response to the growing crisis in Europe. He refused to raise immigration quotas for Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. In 1939, the MS St. Louis, a ship carrying more than 900 Jewish refugees was turned away from U.S. shores. Many of its passengers later died in concentration camps. Roosevelt was not blind to the atrocities, but he was cautious. He feared political backlash. He chose national mood over moral action. Does this mean he wasn't a great leader? Not at all. FDR transformed the presidency. He expanded the role of government to protect citizens. He helped defeat fascism and laid the groundwork for the United Nations. But he also made decisions that violated rights, prolonged suffering, and left lasting scars. He was a visionary who helped millions and failed many others. To understand FDR fully, we must hold both truths: the leader who lifted a nation and the man who looked away. That's not contradiction. That's history. Che Guevara, icon of revolution or machine of violence. His face is printed on t-shirts, murals, coffee mugs, and protest signs. To some, he is the ultimate rebel, a fearless fighter for the oppressed. To others, he's a ruthless revolutionary who chose bullets over ballots. Ernesto Che Guevara was a doctor, a guerrilla leader, a government minister, and an executioner. And the truth about him is far more complicated than his pop culture image suggests. Che was born in Argentina to a middle-class family. In his youth, he traveled across South America and saw widespread poverty, inequality, and injustice. These experiences radicalized him. He believed that only violent revolution could free people from imperialism and capitalism. So he joined Fidel Castro's movement to overthrow Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. In 1959, the Cuban Revolution succeeded. Castro took power, and Che was now part of a new ruling elite. He became head of the National Bank and later Minister of Industries, despite having no formal background in finance or economics. His economic policies were idealistic and disastrous. He rejected material incentives and believed people would work out of revolutionary duty. But production fell. The economy stagnated. Cuba fell deeper into Soviet dependency. But Che wasn't just an economist. He also helped run Cuba's prison system, including La Habana Fortress, where suspected enemies of the revolution were held. Che personally oversaw dozens of executions, often without fair trials. He believed that violence was not only necessary, but cleansing. In his own words, he didn't see his opponents as misguided, he saw them as enemies to be eliminated. He helped set up labor camps, some of which detained dissidents, political rivals, and even gay men. Later, Che tried to export revolution abroad. He traveled to the Congo. The mission failed. He went to Bolivia, hoping to ignite a Latin American uprising. But the locals didn't support him. He was hunted down by the Bolivian army, captured and executed in 1967. He died at 39. And that's when the legend was born. Photos of his dead body spread across the world. To many, he became a martyr. To others, a cautionary tale. So what do we make of him? Che Guevara was brilliant and brutal. He spoke against injustice and truly lived by his ideals, even when they were dangerous. But he also rejected pluralism, suppressed opposition, and justified killing in the name of revolution. He had charisma, discipline, and courage. But he also believed that the ends justified any means. To understand Che fully, you have to look beyond the t-shirt. Because real revolution isn't printed in black and red, it's written in blood and contradictions. Alexander the Great, conqueror of worlds, destroyer of peoples, he was a king by 20. An emperor by 25, and dead by 32. Alexander the Great is remembered as one of history's greatest military minds. He never lost a battle. He conquered the known world. He spread Greek culture across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. But for all the glory, we rarely ask what it cost. Alexander began his conquests in 334 BCE with an invasion of the Persian Empire. In just a few years, he defeated King Darius III, marched through Egypt, and reached as far as India. He founded over 20 cities named after himself, most famously Alexandria in Egypt. He brought philosophers, scientists, and architects with him. He claimed he was spreading civilization. But that's only part of the story. Wherever Alexander went, violence followed. In Thebes, after a rebellion, he had 6,000 people killed and sold the rest into slavery. In Tyre, he laid siege to the city for months, and when it finally fell, he crucified 2,000 men along the coastline. In Gaza, the male population was executed, and survivors were enslaved. These weren't isolated incidents. They were tactics, meant to send a message. Alexander's image was that of a liberator. But many ancient cities saw him as a foreign invader, one who destroyed sacred temples and looted treasuries. He burned Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, possibly in a drunken rage, possibly as revenge. Either way, it was an act of cultural destruction. As he moved east, Alexander became more erratic. He adopted Persian dress and customs. He demanded worship as a living god. Some of his own men began to question him. One night, during a feast, his longtime friend Clitus the Black criticized him. Alexander flew into a rage and stabbed Clitus to death with a spear, then wept afterward. He had become unpredictable, paranoid, and increasingly isolated. Even his dream of unity was more about control than equality. He married Persian women and encouraged his generals to do the same, but forced local elites to bow to Greek customs. It was less cultural exchange and more cultural overwriting. In India, his army finally refused to go further. After years of marching, they were tired of blood and war. Alexander turned back. He died in Babylon at the age of 32, likely from fever, poison, or excessive drinking. No one is sure. His empire, massive and unstable, collapsed within years. His generals carved it into pieces. His dream of global unity died with him. So why is he still called great? Because he changed the map. Because he built cities. Because he inspired legends. But history should also remember, he left destruction in his wake. He saw conquest as destiny. He glorified war, and thousands died for it. He was a genius, a visionary, and a man consumed by ambition. Greatness is not just about what you build. It's also about what you destroy. 7 leaders, 7 legacies, 7 stories with 2 sides. They shaped the world. They gave speeches, won wars, led nations, but they also lied, failed, hurt people, chose power over principle. History likes its heroes simple, but real leadership is never simple. It's messy, it's flawed, it's human. So the next time you see a statue or hear a famous quote, ask yourself, what's the part of the story we weren't told? Because true greatness doesn't fear scrutiny, it welcomes it. This is Lesson Lost, and the lesson is this: every hero has a shadow. Which leader surprised you the most? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone. If this video made you see history differently, hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started.